Welcome to GCSE Biology Paper 1, Bioenergetics, Respiration, Lesson 2. Just a reminder of the top tips to keep you focused and a reminder of the structure of the lesson. Before we get started, can you make sure that you've got all the resources that you need for today's lesson? So can you pause and organize? As always, let's start with retrieval practice, and we'll begin with biology. So pause and retrieve. Here are the answers, so pause and revise. Here are the retrieval questions for chemistry. Pause and retrieve. Here are the answers, so pause and revise. And finally, the physics retrieval questions. Pause and retrieve. Here are the answers, so pause and revise. Remember, it's a good idea to make a set of revision cards for the answers to these questions so you've got them to refer to. Now let's look at yesterday's practice questions, and here are the answers. So these are the answers for the first 6 questions. So can you now pause and check? Here are the answers to question 7. So again, pause and check. Now let's move on to teacher instruction. Here are the questions that we are going to go through today. If you need to print these out, can you now pause and organize? In today's lesson, I want to first of all go through a few examples of respiration. I've chosen an example from animals, so we're going to look at muscle cells, and an example from plants, we're going to look at root hair cells. So as far as muscle cells are concerned, why do muscle cells contain a lot of mitochondria? Well, the first thing to realize is muscle cells are more active than most other cells. Okay, because if you remember, the job of the muscles are to contract, okay, but they're unable to contract without energy, and they get that energy from, the majority of the time, from aerobic respiration. And as we said in the previous lesson, aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria. So let's just make a few notes on why do muscle cells contain a lot of mitochondria. So the first thing, they're more active than other cells. They require more energy to carry out their function. Their function is to contract and do work, which causes motion, causes movement. Now, when a muscle contracts, it gets shorter and wider. Now, to be able to contract, as we've already said, it requires energy. And the majority of the time, that energy comes from aerobic respiration, which takes place in the mitochondria. So muscle cells are packed full of mitochondria, so they get the required energy to continually contract, or to contract as necessary. The second example of respiration I want to look at takes place in plants, and specifically I want to look at the root hair cells. Here I've got a diagram of a root hair cell. I've just circled the mitochondria, so all those red structures represent mitochondria. So there are a lot of mitochondria within a root hair cell. Now the job of the root hair cell is twofold. It's to absorb water from the soil by osmosis, but it's also to absorb mineral ions and salts from the soil. Now, a lot of the time, the concentration of mineral ions is lower in the soil than in the plant. So the only way that the plant can obtain these mineral ions is by active transport. okay? Because they have to move the mineral ions against a concentration gradient. And to do that, you need energy. The plant has to use energy to cause this to happen, okay? And because it requires energy, the root hair cells are jam-packed full of mitochondria so that they can undergo aerobic respiration and transfer energy from the breakdown of glucose. So I just want to recap aerobic respiration with you. So if you remember, aerobic respiration is the breakdown of glucose with oxygen, and that releases a lot of energy, but it also produces the byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. We're now going to look at anaerobic respiration. So what is anaerobic respiration? Well, it's simply respiration without oxygen. So it's the breakdown of the glucose without oxygen. So where does it take place? Now we know that aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria of the cells. Anaerobic respiration actually takes place in the cytoplasm of the cells, so the jelly-like substance. The next thing we need to know is the word equation for anaerobic respiration. Now, the first thing I'm going to give you is the equation for anaerobic respiration in animal cells, such as human muscle cells. And what happens here is the glucose is broken down into a substance called lactic acid. During this process, a small amount of energy is transferred. Okay, and in fact, 20 times less energy is released from anaerobic respiration than from aerobic respiration. And the reason for that is because the glucose is not completely broken down. So that's the word equation for anaerobic respiration in animal cells. Now let's have a look at the word equation for anaerobic respiration in yeast cells and some plant cells. So here, again, it's glucose being broken down without oxygen, but this time the products are ethanol and carbon dioxide, plus a small amount of energy. So that is the second anaerobic respiration word equation you need to know. So you've got the word equation for anaerobic respiration in animals, and now you've got the word equation for anaerobic respiration in some plants and in yeast cells. What we need to do now to summarize aerobic and anaerobic respiration is to do a comparison between the two. If you printed out the resources, on the key knowledge sheet there will be a Venn diagram. So as I go through the similarities and differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, can you complete that Venn diagram? So now let's jot down the similarities and differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Well, the first difference is aerobic respiration requires oxygen. So glucose reacts with oxygen to release energy, and anaerobic respiration is without oxygen. We know they both require glucose, and we know they both release energy. The difference, though, is that aerobic respiration releases more energy than anaerobic, and anaerobic respiration releases less energy than aerobic. In aerobic respiration, the glucose is completely broken down. In anaerobic respiration, it is not completely broken down. It's incomplete respiration. We know the products of aerobic respiration are carbon dioxide and water. And we know that the products of anaerobic respiration in animals is lactic acid, and in plants or some plants and in yeast, it's ethanol and carbon dioxide. And the final thing is we know that aerobic respiration takes place in the mitochondria and anaerobic respiration takes place in the cytoplasm. On your Venn diagram, in the middle, where you have the similarities, the only two things that you should have in there are glucose is needed and they both release energy. Okay, now what I'd like you to do is embed all this new knowledge. So can you now pause and embed? Now that you've hopefully embedded all that knowledge, you are going to do some practice, some slop. If you haven't printed out the questions, here they are. So you've got questions 1 to 4 to answer, 5 to 8, and finally question 9. So can you now pause and slop? Answers will be discussed in the next lesson. Until then, do some retrieval practice. Remember, we've got the recall tests on Friday. Make sure you've completed all the slop and make sure everybody knows about this video. Until next time, see you soon.